It's great to see parents, teachers, and students here. And I'm going to turn it over to Anthony, who I know is planning to have a conversation with y'all, including you asking things and talking. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Bertus, for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming tonight. And also, thanks to Clarke Central High, to the Media Center, to the Interact Club, and to the PTSO for organizing this event. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you, to hear from you about what's happening in this community. And I've been fortunate that some of the things that Bertus has taken me around to see have been like this morning we went to Clarke Middle School and got to tour the school and see the program there. And this afternoon we interacted with Rick Dunn on the radio, and so I've gotten a little bit of a flavor of Athens, Georgia, and I hope to be able to come back soon and spend more time here. I want to share with you to start with a little bit of my own journey as an educator in relationship to education reform. As Bertus mentioned, I worked in the Oakland, California schools, and I was a middle school science teacher there for 18 years. And around the early 2000s, something happened in our school. And it probably happened in just about every school in the country, and that was No Child Left Behind. And so and really that's what started this journey for me. And in a sense, I've become a bit of a crusader. That's what my wife calls me. But I didn't pick this fight. You know, the fight came into my school. The corporate reformers came to my school and said that it was failing based on test scores. And so about 6 years ago, I started writing about education reform from the perspective of a classroom teacher, because I thought that the voices of educators, especially of classroom teachers, were really missing from the decisions that were being made about schools. And something happened around 2010. There was a film that came out, sort of a documentary called Waiting for Superman. And that movie was designed to really discredit public schools and promote in their place charter schools and discredit teachers' unions and really discredit teachers, in effect. And there was the documentary was released, and then there was 2 episodes of the Oprah Winfrey Show devoted to promoting the movie. There was a week-long series of specials on NBC News called Education Nation, and we were introduced to characters like Michelle Rhee, and we found out that Bill Gates had a lot to say about education. And in fact, when I started looking, I saw that Education Nation was in fact sponsored by the Gates Foundation. Waiting for Superman was being promoted with several $million of grants from the Gates Foundation to make sure that it was distributed across the country. And so I started paying attention to what Bill Gates' ideas were about education. What I discovered was that Gates has really 3 guiding principles which he applies to education. The first is that student learning must be measured. And it must be measured so that it can be managed from above. So that the second concept is that in order for there to be innovation in education, there has to be competition. There has to be competition between schools, even competition between teachers. So we've got a lot of programs to incentivize better teaching, and actually assuming that teachers are going to be motivated by this, which so far hasn't worked. The third big idea that Gates has really been advancing is that technology is going to transform education in foundational ways. This leads to some policy goals. First of all, standardized testing, the Common Core standards, which the Gates Foundation sponsored and spent several $100 million paying for, basically, and continues to pay for the promotion of the Common Core standards. And then, of course, the tests aligned with the Common Core standards. Then charter schools, and the Gates Foundation has heavily promoted charter schools and provided grants to school districts if they will allow the expansion of charter schools. And then technology and data systems, because that is supposed to transform our schools. Around 2010, Bill Gates said this. He said, aligning teaching with the Common Core and building common data standards will help us define excellence, measure progress, test new methods, and compare results. Finally, we will apply the tools of science to school reform. He also said at around that same time, he and his wife Melinda published an op-ed in which they said, the field of education does not know very much about effective teaching. And so they entered this arena, assuming that those of us who have dedicated our lives to schools know very little about the work that we've been doing for the last however many years. So, if most of us who are in whatever endeavor, if somebody walked in and said, you all are a bunch of amateurs and you don't know what the heck you're doing, we would say, well, thanks, we'll see you later. We really don't have a lot of use for you. So why is it that this one individual's opinions have become so consequential? And, this individual happens to be a college dropout. The fact is that he is, of course, as you know, one of the richest men in the world, and his foundation is the largest philanthropic organization in the world, and that foundation has made education its #1 domestic priority. So his money matters, and the way he has made it matter is very strategic. The Gates Foundation funds research. They pay for think tanks. Whole organizations have sprung up with funding from the Gates Foundation. Organizations like the Data Quality Council that ranks and compares states on how much attention they pay to student and measuring student test scores. The National Council on Teacher Quality, which is in the process of rating schools of education based on whether or not they pay enough attention to test scores. And dozens, literally dozens and dozens of other organizations that issue reports that look academic, but they're not peer reviewed. They're basically opinion pieces that are dressed up with statistics and bar graphs and citations so that they look like academic research. And then those think tank papers are presented to legislatures as policy documents that are intended to inform their policies. And then the experts that are on the Gates Foundation payroll will travel to legislatures and testify in front of those legislatures to support the policies that are aligned with these values. There are what are called astroturf groups, basically organizations of whether it's parents or teachers who are sort of groomed to likewise testify. For example, there's a group called Educators for Excellence, and they prepare teacher leaders they ask them to sign a statement that says they agree with evaluating teachers based on test scores. And then these teacher leaders will again be brought to state legislature to testify in favor of the elimination of seniority or the elimination of due process. The Gates Foundation also transferred high-level staff to the Department of Education. So when the Department of Education in 2009 got $4.5 billion of stimulus money, the Race to the Top grants were written along the lines of Gates Foundation priorities. To get a Race to the Top grant, you had to basically, as a state, you had to adopt college and career-ready standards, of which the Common Core was the most readily available form. You had to agree to require teachers to be evaluated with a significant weight being put on test scores, and you had to remove limits on the expansion of charter schools. So, and the funny thing, not the unfunny thing about this whole competitive grant system was a lot of states made these changes and didn't even get the money because it was a competitive grant system. So you would get points for doing all these things, but you weren't guaranteed the funding anyway. So a lot of states made all those changes and didn't even get the bribe that they were promised for making those changes. The Gates Foundation also sponsors media coverage of education. So when you're listening to NPR or PBS, you'll often hear education reporting underwritten by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Education Writers Association, which after I won their award, I won 3 awards from them, including a first prize last year for opinion writing. Last year, this year, when I submitted my application again, they told me that they had changed the rules and that I no longer qualified to compete in their competition. And of course, one of their leading funders is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They said I was insufficiently independent of the subject that I cover. Now, the reporters who work on the Gates-funded Seattle Education Lab, which is devoted to telling stories about what works in education, they will be continued to allow to compete in this competition. They're sufficiently independent, but myself, because I'm an advocate of public education and I push back against the reforms of the Gates Foundation, I am not independent. So what happened with my writing was I did eventually catch the attention of some people at the Gates Foundation. And this happened about 3 years ago. I got an email from somebody high up at the Gates Foundation who wanted a dialogue with me about some of the issues that I was raising about their work. And so I went back and forth with this person for several months. And at a certain point I said, well, you know, if we're gonna hash this out, maybe I should come up to Seattle and talk with your education team. And so in the summer of 2012, I flew up to Seattle and spent the day discussing these issues with people at the Gates Foundation in their palatial $500 million office building. And we didn't get that far then either, unfortunately, but we agreed to exchange views through our blogs. They have a blog called Impatient Optimists, and my blog is Living in Dialogue. So we went back and forth. They allowed me to suggest the topics, and so we discussed what are the big issues. We talked about how do we improve the teaching profession. We talked about how can you use evidence of student learning in evaluating teachers. What's a sensible way to do that? We talked about what's the role of poverty. Can we defeat poverty in our schools by ignoring poverty? Because that's sort of the central message of the education reform idea. And what's the role of the marketplace in education? What's the role of incentivizing and profit making and so forth? In the end, unfortunately, we didn't really reach a whole lot of common ground. They ended up deciding that since I was so concerned about poverty, I must therefore have the belief that poor children can't learn. And that's really the caricature that has been painted of teachers ever since No Child Left Behind came along. That if we refuse to take responsibility for fixing poverty as educators, then we must believe that poor children can't learn. And this is obviously a gross misrepresentation of the situation. More recently, the Gates Foundation has a new CEO. Her name is Sue Desmond-Hellman, and she has a background in medicine, and she worked in Uganda for a couple of years, and she gave an interview recently where she said, one of the things I learned in working in the developing world is that you have to listen and learn and come with an attitude of humility. And so I wrote a post where I said, this is a refreshing change of perspective from the Gates Foundation. I wonder if you're going to apply this same approach to education reform. And I tweeted it to her, and she replied, thank you for the feedback. Yes, we will. And then I tweeted her, well, would you like a copy of my book? I'll send it to you. And she hasn't replied to that. So I don't know. I think maybe she already has a copy, I'm sure. But I am going to send her a copy anyway. Really, what one of the problems with the Gates Foundation approach, they have this project called the Measures of Effective Teaching. And so, as I said, one of their central ideas is that measurement is crucial. And of course, the only way that they can quantify teaching or the effectiveness of teaching is through test scores. And so when you've heard, I'm sure, that the state of Georgia is now planning to base 50% of a teacher's evaluation on test scores. And in New York State, they're doing the same thing. And this model really comes from the work that the Gates Foundation has promoted. There's some huge problems with this. With value-added systems, you can have a teacher who's in the top quintile quartile 1 year, and 20% of the teachers in the top quartile 1 year will be in the bottom quartile the next year. And that's a function both of the small numbers that we're dealing with. Also, if you happen to get a bunch of English learners in your class one year, your scores are gonna stink. If you have some special ed kids, the chances are your scores are gonna not be great, because special ed kids don't tend to do well on standardized tests. And that, of course, that's a generalization, but on average. And the value-added systems are incapable of really discerning that. So we've created an idea that teacher evaluation is how you give feedback to teachers. And Bill Gates was recently interviewed, was asked how their work is going, and he said something really strange, which is, we have this project where we are working with teachers to give one another feedback. That is how he described their work. We're working in some districts to have teachers observe one another and give each other feedback. If that was the essence of their work, my book would have no relevance at all. The actual essence of their work has been all about measuring, even as he said a few years ago. And so it's been about measuring and defining based on test scores student learning. And I want to describe for you some alternatives to this. Because I worked at a school in Oakland, as I mentioned, for 18 years, we had high turnover in our science department. We had a department of about 10 teachers, and every year 2 or 3 teachers would leave. And we would bring new teachers in, and then we were constantly turning over teachers. And This was endemic across Oakland, actually. Especially in the higher the poverty school, the higher the turnover would be. So what we decided to do as a science department was take it upon ourselves with a little bit of funding from the state. We got a grant, and for each newer teacher, we assigned them a more experienced teacher as their personal mentor and guide. We had them work side by side. We didn't have any extra time to do this. We just would meet at lunchtime. We'd share lesson ideas. We'd observe one another teach. We worked together as a faculty to do some things like lesson study and research assessment practices. We were able to stabilize our department, and we didn't lose, for 2 years, we didn't lose any teachers. When I left the classroom, I replicated this district-wide, because as I said, this was a district-wide problem. We have a reform model that is based on the idea that our existing teachers are not good enough, and we need to weed them out. And in the process, we are making the education of our students bankrupt. And we are making life miserable for our classroom teachers, in part because of the irrational systems that we're putting in place, in part because of the extra work that we're requiring them to do. We're requiring credentialed teachers to assemble portfolios proving that they're effective, spending dozens and dozens of hours generating documentation to justify the fact that they're actually teaching. And meanwhile, the evaluation is being based on that test score that has become all important. As the students will tell you, when a test score becomes the objective for learning, as a teacher, if a student asked me, why are we learning this? And of course, I heard that more than once. If I had to say because it's on a test, I felt I had really lost my way. Even when I found, and sometimes as a teacher, you get frustrated if students aren't listening, and you sort of say, well, this is going to be on the test on Friday, so you better listen. But I can tell you that is a very poor motivation for students to learn. And the response from our system to this has been to say, well, then we need to make those tests matter. We need to tell the students if they don't pass those tests. And I was on a panel once with a principal. She said, we tell our fourth graders, if they don't do well on the test, then they're not going to go to college. If they don't go to college, then they're not going to get a good job. If they don't get a good job, then they can't get a house, and they can't support a family. And so the reason these students have to buckle down and listen is if they don't, they're going to be living in a cardboard box. That's the long and the short of it. And as a science teacher, I would much rather inspire my students to do things that matter in the world, to learn about the natural world, to feel empowered about their own ability to investigate and design experiments and change the world. That's what education is all about. I was recently in New York State, and I visited a school that's part of something called a performance consortium. And these schools have a waiver from the state's Regents exam, which is the high school graduation exam. Instead of doing this big high stakes test at the end of high school, what they have their students do is assemble a portfolio of work in multiple disciplines, and that reflects what the teachers have decided is really important in math and social studies and science. And those students have to defend that portfolio to their teachers, who actually interrogate them about what they understand. Those students are far better prepared, and I can tell you they have statistics to back this up. Those students persist better in college. They have better college success rates than students that are passing the Regents exam. It is more difficult for those students to do this. It is more challenging. So when you hear somebody, and it's more difficult for the teachers too, because they have to they have to think creatively about how are we going to challenge our students? How are we going to engage them? How can we overcome if they're apathetic? How can we get them engaged? So this idea that we are raising the bar by making these tests more and more difficult is nonsense. If you want to raise the bar, demand that people think. If you want to raise the bar, demand that people exhibit original thought and creativity. If you want your students thinking critically, then shouldn't their teachers be modeling critical thinking in their teaching? Shouldn't they be thinking for themselves as they design lessons? Why should they be following a script that is aligned to a test that is checked every 6 weeks by a benchmark exam? This is the de-skilling and deprofessionalizing and dumbing down of both our teaching profession and of our students. I want to talk a little bit about technology. I mentioned the Gates Foundation is very high on the idea of computers in school. Bill Gates talked about MOOCs. So you guys know what MOOCs are? It's mass open courses. It's basically online college courses and high school courses. He's had this idea for a while that if we get the best teachers in the world and we videotape them, and then we show students the videos and they can watch the videos over and over again. So he's invested millions of dollars in the Khan Academy. It's not worthless, but it is not the aspiration of education. And the ironic thing is they call this whole trend personalization. Having students interact with a screen is personalized because the student is poking the screen, So the student is the person, but the device is the center of the learning. It's not truly student-centered learning, it's device-centered learning. And the idea is that all the learning flows through this device, and then the teacher gets all this data, and the teacher can kind of be like a pilot in an airplane and monitor what everybody's doing. And then the students are all working at their own pace. And of course, we know that true personalization involves persons. And in the absence of persons, a lot of students don't do very well. And Gates even acknowledged this. About a year ago, he was interviewed, and somebody asked him, how's this educational technology stuff doing? And he said, well, it's not doing that great. It's not doing as well as we'd hoped. He said, it seems to work very well with motivated students, but you know what? We have a lot of unmotivated students here in this country. And so, when I saw that, I thought, wow, all these teacher evaluation systems, is there a box on there that they ask the teachers, were your students motivated or not?
No.
No, they don't ask you that, but Gates is kind of allowing his pet project to use this excuse. So, so when they talk about no excuses education reform, you really have to question whether they are actually applying that idea to themselves. The last thing I want to talk about is sort of stepping back into a big picture of what we are preparing our students for. Where is our economy going? Because a lot of the rhetoric around Common Core is all about preparing our students for college and career. And there's this idea that we're somehow going to resurrect the middle class by sending everyone to college. Now, when I've looked into economic projections and even current economic data, there are some real holes in this whole idea. First of all, STEM is a very good sort of example of this. If you look below, if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric around education reform, you know that there's a STEM crisis, right? How many of you have heard of the STEM crisis, right? We're short of engineers. We're short of scientists. Well, if you actually look closely, you'll discover that about half of the people with STEM degrees aren't working in STEM careers. You'll discover that Microsoft just laid off about 18,000 STEM workers in the state of Washington. You'll discover that there really is not a shortage of people with engineering degrees. There's a shortage of people with engineering degrees willing to work for about $30,000 to $40,000. And so the corporations that want, perhaps the corporations, it's difficult. I try to avoid imputing motives as much as I can. But perhaps it could be that the corporations that need scientists and engineers want enough of them that they don't have to pay them very much. That's one theory. Another, and that's kind of a very visible example of a bigger issue, which is where is our economy heading with technology? I saw a report last year from Oxford University, which some researchers there looked at what's happening with technology and how that's affecting jobs. And when they looked at technologies that are currently in the works, they project that by the year, in around 20 years, the number of full-time jobs needed to run the economy in the United States will be lowered by about 45%. So we now have about 130 million people working full-time. You take 40% off of that, you're down to around 80 million. So if you think about our student population, we're graduating millions of students every year into that labor market. And meanwhile, we have the Common Core standards. And what is happening and the purpose of the Common Core standards is to prepare students for college and career, right? To designate who of our students are prepared for college and career. To sort our students into two piles, the ones that are ready for college and career and the ones that are not. So what proportion of our students are now being sorted in that sorting arrangement? Right now, the Common Core tests that have been given thus far have been determining that about 30% of our students are ready for college and career, and about 70% are not ready for college and career. So again, I hesitate to impute motive, but one theory that occurred to me is perhaps the economy of the next 20 years is not capable of absorbing all of the high school graduates that would be produced. And so perhaps if we create a system that only says a third of our graduates are actually worthy of careers, are worthy of middle-class jobs, are worthy of getting into college, then we can rationalize why the other two-thirds are being rendered surplus by the economy. So what I come to is the point where we need to stop allowing billionaires to dictate our economic policy, to dictate our educational policy. No one elected Bill Gates. No one chose the Common Core standards except for a few governors who were offered multi-million-dollar grants in exchange for doing so. So around the country, there are people who are organizing to resist this. There are students who are walking out from standardized tests. There are students who are, with the support of their parents, opting out of high-stakes tests. There are teachers who are, I just wrote about a group of 4 teachers in Renton, Washington, which is near Seattle. These 4 teachers went to their school board last week, stood up and said, we refuse to give the standardized tests because of the damage we see it doing to our students. There are teachers in New York State who are doing this. About 40,000 students in the state of New York opted out of the standardized test last year, and there will be more that will be opting out this year. I work with an organization called the Network for Public Education, which is, our president is Diane Ravitch, and we are working to mobilize resistance nationally to support candidates who are willing to push back against this, to bring people together. We're having our second annual conference in Chicago at the end of April, and we'll have activists and organizers and teachers and students from all over the country coming together to learn from one another. And so I hope that you and your community, I wanted to mention, I mentioned at the beginning, I had a chance to visit Clarke Middle School this morning and see the agriculture program. The way that we reach students is by really teaching the whole child. When we narrow down on tests and we force educators, coerce educators into doing that, we eliminate so much that is so important. And you know, one of the things I do in the workshops I do around project-based learning, the teachers that I work with want to do this kind of work, but they're feeling this intense pressure. So before we even start our work together, we create a list. I ask them to think about their ideal graduate and what are the qualities and characteristics of a student that if you could envision that student crossing the stage, what do you want that student, if it's a child of yours or if it's a student of yours? And the list, no matter where I go, is always the same. We want our graduates to be compassionate. We want them to be able to persevere. We want them to be critical thinkers, problem solvers. We want them to be able to work together with one another. And when we look at that list, almost none of those things are measured by test scores. And when we narrow our teaching and coerce teachers into focusing only on test scores, we prevent them from doing the kind of work that can engage and excite students. And the saddest thing is I spend 3 days working with teachers on project-based learning, and sometimes we get, and the whole purpose of the workshop is for them to design an engaging, exciting project that takes their students into their community. And the saddest thing is sometimes we get to the third day and they have this fantastic project design, and then I say, well, when are you going to do this? And they say, well, I hope I can get to do it in May after we finish testing. And, you know, the schools that are capable of taking this on and really doing it comprehensively, like the schools that I mentioned in New York, there's a school called Mission Hill in Boston. There's a documentary film called A Year at Mission Hill that portrays this K-8 school in an urban community in Boston, shows how the students are challenged. They have these middle school kids and they ask them, what career interests you? And then once the kids say, whatever the kid is interested in, they find somebody in the community for that student to interview who has done that career. It doesn't matter what the kid wants to do. You know, one of the kids interviewed a stock car racer, driver. And, find out, what is it like? What do you need to do to prepare for that career? What's it like to be a stock car driver? And then the students write that up. They actually published a book with all these portraits of all these different careers. That is a challenging, engaging project. You let teachers design things like that. Now, the problem with that is you can't standardize it, because that project might be great one year, maybe the next year they want to do something about zoo design. Who knows what they want to do from one year to the next? So you can't standardize it. You have to allow and actually invite teachers to be thinking professionals. Invite students to be creative, autonomous participants in a learning community. And that's the kind of school that we need to create room for in our school system, and we need to demand as a community that every student have access to. So with that, I want to shift into a chance to hear from you all and discuss what your thoughts are.
Thanks.
Sure. Thank you.
So during the Q&A, Anthony's going to tell us what he really thinks. I'm happy to report that as you sit here in Clarke Central, there are a lot of kids like you're talking about. Some of them are getting ready to graduate.
Yeah.
And some have been together since even before pre-K. But we want to improve the school. We want to make the school better. We want to support a thriving school. And the people who come through that front door, often once they get in here, they realize we have a pretty thriving school with some problems.
Yeah.
And some of the problems, depending on where you define where they come from, a lot of us are parents, a lot of, I look around there, a lot of teachers, a lot of students. So that's my question to get us started.
Sure.
But that's the overarching question. I want to call on somebody. Raise some hands so I can decide who I'm going to call on. I see a hand back there.
This
Sarah?
board is not very long, though.
Oh, okay.
You're going to
So-
reach back there.
Oh, Sarah, and
You've only got about 10 feet
ask a
here.
question if you want, yeah.
I was wondering about those students and teachers who are opting out of the test. When I taught in Denver Public Schools 20 years ago, I did that because I was only in a school for a year, and because I was teaching all the kids in Spanish, to read and write in Spanish, and then the test was in English. And so, and there was 3 days, and I said, I'm just not gonna do it, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I mean, how am I gonna tell these kids, just
Right.
fill it in? And all the other teachers were telling the kids, just fill it in. And I was idealistic and 25 and said, no. And I was leaving the school anyway,
Yeah.
and I always wondered what happened to those kids. Like, I was always worried that my decision affected where they ended up, at least in the next year. I mean, do you know sort of what happens now when people opt out of the test?
Well, there's a real tension. Do I need the mic? Okay. There's a real tension now because if enough, it's like any act of civil disobedience. If one person does something, it's fairly easy for the system to punish that person, that transgressor. If a lot of people do it, then it becomes much more difficult to exact any consequence on them. So the best thing that can happen from my point of view is that large numbers of people opt out. And there are schools, I was just in New York, there are schools where 90% of the parents opted their children out. In Brooklyn, there was one in the Bronx. And these are not, there's a caricature of this that it's only the middle class parents that are opting their kids out. These are working class Latino parents. It takes a lot of work within the parent community to help people understand what's going on. So it takes some organizing to do this. There are a bunch of one of the tools people are using, there are some documentary films that are out, and there's one called Race to Nowhere that has a really nice community engagement part, and they're working on a sequel now. They were up in New York when I was there filming at the Performance Consortium. They're creating a sequel called Defies Measurement that shows alternatives to the high stakes testing. So one of the things people have done is they'll bring that film in, and they'll have a discussion in the community about what do we want and how can we create it within our schools.
Sarah, one of the panels at Chicago is going to be the filmmakers who made Go Public, which showed here, husband and wife team from Pasadena, about Pasadena schools, and Shannon Puckett, who made Defies Measurement.
No, actually, Shannon made another movie with a similar title. There are about a dozen extremely talented people creating documentaries right now about this issue, and some of them are already out. And some of them are in the works right now.
We're going to have a panel
But-
about using documentary
Yeah.
film in community engagement pieces, and we're going to get the title of the film right. I think it's Beyond Measure.
I think it's beyond measure.
it's
You're
beyond
right.
measure.
It has the word measure.
My
in it,
typo.
but
I make a lot
yeah.
of typos.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned New York and that Brooklyn situation. One of the fiercest, 2 or 3 of the fiercest, that people make Anthony look low key on this stuff, are private school teachers and headmasters. One in New York, Paul Horton from Chicago Lab School, where Arnie Duncan's kids went. It's great private school. All of our kids would be doing great at Chicago Lab School. But these are people are speaking out at least as strenuously as Anthony on these same issues. So they know what works. They know what works for their kids, and they see what their colleagues in public schools are having to put up with for their working conditions.
Yeah.
Next question. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, I just have a question on high stakes tests, and this is just my observation. I've worked in a lot of schools, is that, how to phrase this, my kid can do a portfolio, and we can have people judge it and give them critique, and you know, and that can work. I've seen in some inner city, high poverty areas where kids who can't read and write would do a portfolio, and it would pass because, you know, they wanted to pass it, but the kids still couldn't read and write. So my understanding or my experience with standardized testing, a lot of it, quite frankly, seemed to be for those unmotivated kids to show, you know, are they really learning? Because the motivated kid is more likely to have other opportunities. So that's my question. Is that part of the problem? Is that part of the situation?
Well-
How do we address that?
Well, I don't have, I mean, I can talk about project-based learning and doing engaging things. Even that is not a cure-all. I have nothing, and I would argue that the high-stakes testing regime that we have, this idea, you know, Arnie Duncan said a few years ago, I want to be able to look every second grader in the eye and tell him whether or not he's on track for college. And so this idea that having high-stakes tests is somehow going to scare these kids into learning or motivate them, I don't see that happening. Now, if the idea is, do we know whether or not they can read? I can tell you as an educator that you do not need a standardized test to know whether a child can read. And if the issue is a school being irresponsible about simply passing children on who can't read, then I would say that there are far better ways to address that as a community than reducing our educational values to standardized tests. So you should have parent involvement, community involvement. There should be ways, learning should be on display, including a student's capacity to read and write and speak publicly and solve problems. And so if a student does a portfolio and you can't tell whether or not that student can read, I would say there's something wrong with your portfolio. And if you look at the New York Performance Consortium and the portfolio that they establish, or at Mission Hill School and the requirements for an 8th grader to pass from their school with their portfolio, you will not see students graduating or passing that portfolio benchmark without being able to read, without being able to write, without being able to solve math problems.
I just could say, I saw kids pass who couldn't read and write, and because there was no testing. And that's it. That's my only thing, is and I'll be quiet.
All right. Well, as I said, I think there are far better ways.
Sure.
There is no law. One of the fallacies of this whole model is this idea that we are going to manage everything. We are going to ensure. And this was No Child Left Behind. If you recall, in 2001, we were told every single child in America would be proficient by the year 2014 if we institute these tests. You know, we have people who are saying, well, the problem is we're passing 3rd graders and they don't know how to read, so we're going to require any third grader to pass a standardized test in order to graduate from the third grade. The problem is, it is not in the interests of those children. It doesn't work. So we need to look, we need to be smart enough as educators and as policymakers to take responsibility to look at what actually works. And if it worked to hold a child back at the third grade and make sure they could all read, then I wouldn't have a problem with it. But it's not entirely a philosophical argument. There is some philosophical component to it, but some part of it is empirical as well. And so I think we've tried this long enough.
One of the things that you really scored points on with Tim today, he was on Tim Bryant's show, and it was kind of typical Tim Bryant handling up a guy like Anthony Cody. It was very, it was a good radio for Tim and his audience. But he, at the end, he shared with you that one of the things you said really resonated with him, which was that he never thought the whole thing about having standards and high-stakes testing, he'd always been kind of accepted that raised standards. And you flipped that, and you said, what you're doing is you're narrowing it. You had a very artful way of explaining it to the point where you convinced Tim Bryant you had a point. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do in this town when you're coming from your perspective. But that was an argument that seemed to work with him. He complimented you on it, and he said, made me look at it a different way.
Yeah.
I saw a hand. Alex?
I raised my hand.
Oh. All right, Alex.
That's a good strategy, a good teaching strategy. Find the guy who's sitting back in the easy chair and say, Alex, what's your question?
I made a bid for that.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
I did have a thought though. So two things. We keep bringing up Bill Gates and all his money and all his corporate.
Sure.
Is he doing this for his profit?
That's a great question. And again, as I've said twice already, that I try to avoid imputing motives. But I have spent enough time, listening to him being interviewed. It's hard to imagine how much money $70 billion is that he's sitting on. And depending on the stock market today, maybe it's 75 billion. That's $70,000 million. So you could spend $1 million a day for 70,000 days, which is beyond all of our lifespans, and you could not spend all of that money. So it's hard to, but he's an intensely competitive individual. And so there's I don't know how many of you remember the Lily Tomlin character, the little girl. She used to say, my friends say I'm bossy, but my ideas is just better. and so I think he actually thinks that the way that he conquered the computer industry is applicable to education. That we need a common operating system, that we need a profit and loss, a way of keeping track of, we need a bottom line. So we're going to use test scores for the bottom line.
Socket thing.
We need to standardize. He talks about the classrooms are like electrical sockets. They should all be the same so that we can plug in, we can have innovators create all the different appliances that plug into our classrooms. And obviously from my perspective as a science teacher, I wanted to be the innovator. And I thought our school was much better when our educators were innovators and we weren't all required to be standardized for the convenience of people selling us iPads and software learning systems. But so I think he honestly believes that children will learn better if innovation, if technology is allowed to transform education. And I think he thinks that market competition is necessary to allow that competition to occur or that innovation to occur. And so I don't think it's mainly about him trying to find a way to make money through education. I think he thinks that you have to make education profitable in order to have it be transformed by innovation. That's a great question. And you know, I just got an email this afternoon from a student in Ohio who's read my blog, and he said, I just started a petition, an online petition against high stakes testing, and can you help me spread it? He has about 235 signatures. This is for one of those White House petitions, and it used to be you needed 10,000 signatures for a response. Now you need 100,000 in a month. So it's very difficult to get a response from the White House, and I can tell you as someone who's tried to get a response from the White House, very, very, very challenging. The only time I ever got a response was when I pointed out that President Obama was actually criticizing his own policies. Then I got a response from the Department of Education who said, no, he's not, but he was. But anyway, to answer your question, what I told him, I suggested a couple of things. There's a group in Providence, Rhode Island called the Providence Student Union. They've done some fantastic actions. They organized, they did two things on the state. They had a state sort of a graduation test, which was called the kneecap, which is sort of mafiosa-like, but that's what it was called. Sort of kneecap the students as they're crossing the stage, they organized a zombie march because they said high stakes testing was zombifying education. And then the other thing they did to follow that up was they organized a bunch of professionals to take this high stakes test. And then they posted their results, and 60%.
They proctored it, didn't they? Give the test.
They gave the test. They had all these people like yourselves come to a library and take the test, and then lo and behold, 60% of these working professionals were incompetent, were unready for their career, and so they're all gone back to school now, but to prepare for the Common Core test, But so those were two very effective things, and they've lobbied the state legislature. So you can look them up online, Providence Student
And you know what? One of the kids, we met him in Austin, you'll remember his name, but one of their star student, he was a senior last year, he got a scholarship to Georgia Tech. He's in Atlanta. He's a veteran student activist, 2 years older than you, Emma. Emma's a junior. So I don't know, next year y'all should have him come over and do an Interact Club.
Yeah,
they have an Interact Club
fantastic.
meeting every week,
Fantastic.
I think. So
Yeah.
he's right here.
The other thing I suggested, well, two other things I suggested to him was the Race to Nowhere movie that I already mentioned. They have a community engagement process, so you can bring that film and show it in, you could bring it here to the media center and get a crowd like this together, and then, talk among your community with the parents and the students. What are we going to do about this? And figure out for yourselves what you're going to do. The other thing is come to Chicago and join us at the, we're going to be meeting for a couple of days at the Drake Hotel. There are going to be student activists from the Newark Student Union. They've led walkouts in their city to protest school closings. Students from Chicago will be there. There's some very active Chicago Student Union.
There's scholarships for students.
Yeah, there are some scholarships available for students. We've got to wait and see how many donations
I know.
we get.
Be an optimist.
I'm-
Be an optimist.
I hate to go around promising people money when we have so little. Unfortunately, yes.
Well, yeah.
The
We're not
Gates-
expecting a big grant.
The Gates Foundation has not responded to our request.
Lillian?
Let's say that an opinion grows and people begin to dislike the Bill Gates method as much as you do, and then it is no more.
Yes.
What is on the plate next?
Well,
To help teachers and students.
Great.
Well, the first thing that I would say that's necessary to help teachers and students is for us to get away from this idea that education can fix poverty. We have got, as a society, to address poverty directly. And we cannot continue this trend. If you look at the gross domestic product, it is climbing, climbing, climbing. And all you hear is we don't have money for schools, we don't have enough money, there's not enough money, there's not enough money, there's not enough money, we can't pay the pensions, we can't do this, we can't do that. Where did all the money go? You know, the money is, 90-some% of the money since the crash in 2008 has gone to the 1%. And until we confront that, we are not going to, we are leaving schools and students. We have more child poverty than practically any other developed country in the world. 1 in 4 children in this country are living in poverty, and the definition of poverty is very poor. Roughly 1 in 2 children in public schools are living in poverty. So the first thing we have to do is destroy the fiction that teachers and schools can fix poverty by themselves. This part of that, the second thing we need to do is, if we want a school system that embraces our children, then as a community we need to address the problems that poverty generates. That's sort of a halfway step. I'm really calling for more fundamental economic change, and I think we need to challenge our economic system, challenge the powers that be, challenge the hedge fund managers that continue to collect multi-million-dollar bonuses, continue to pay pittance in their taxes. Do you know that money from investment is only taxed at 15%? So if you work for a living, your money is taxed at a 30% rate. Somebody who happens to have $1 million and sticks it in an investment, he only pays a 15% rate on his gains on his investment. So why is it that in the 1950s, corporate tax rate was about 80%? That was a time of tremendous economic growth in this nation. It did not stifle economic growth. So we've got to revisit, and if you look at Europe, all the countries that have instituted these austerity policies, that have laid off government employees, that have cut pensions, their economies are in the tank. And in Europe, people are starting to rise up. If you see the pictures, I've seen pictures on Facebook in Spain, there's just millions of people in the street. And it's probably going to take millions of people in the street in the United States of America before we get some fundamental economic change, because people do not give up this money without a very good reason, unfortunately. But I think in the shorter term, doing things like community schools that actually address the conditions of the material effects of poverty on children is really a valuable thing that we can do as a community. And so I understand that there's work underway in that direction in this community, and I think that's a really important thing to do. I think the idea that our schools contain all of our children, that they contain our future in microcosm, that we are preparing our students to live in community with one another, I think that value has to be elevated. And we need to defend and project that value in the face of people who are proposing that we create privileged enclaves, that we have gated communities, that we have schools for the haves and we have schools for the have-nots, that we have a different type of education that is required for the students of poverty than is afforded to the students of privilege. We reinforce, a lot of times this is done with the rhetoric that it is in the interest of the poor children. But the reality is that this testing system replicates privilege and does not redress inequity. And so we need to destroy that illusion because it has not worked and it will not work. And we need to create a new vision for the community that says we embrace the whole child and we embrace all of the children.
That's all your hand.
So, I mean, with that in mind, like, is this, talking about equity, because, you know, you can throw it back to the communities, but then you have an equity problem. So, is it gonna come to a national solution with this? Or like, I mean, are we past the point where it's gonna come back to the communities? Like the Department of Ed's got their hooks in it, and it's kind of pointing a return? Like,
Well,
what
the
is
Department of Ed is a highly political institution, and the Department of Ed responds to what it perceives as the political situation. And right now, they're attempting to bull their way through the current opposition that they're running into. But as that opposition grows, they can't ignore it. And so, you know, there are some states that are much more resistant than others. There are states like New York where there's very intense conflict between the State Department of Ed and the principals. The principals of the schools in New York have signed petitions opposing the evaluation system that the State Department of Ed created. So there's a lot of resistance growing, and so I don't think I never think we're past the point of resisting. I think human civilization endures times of repression and times of rebellion and times of resistance, and right now we're in a time of both rising repression and rising resistance.
To your point about where it's going to come from, federal, local, community, there's a website weekly they put out. This is a website that's been going 30 years. It's an organization called the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, fairtest.org. You go to fairtest.org, there's a weekly summary of testing resistance around the country. These are local stories from Orlando. These are teachers of conscience in Renton, Washington. This is John King resigning as the education secretary in New York because his own kids are in a Montessori school that doesn't get tested. But he's passing these draconian laws that say 70% of our kids are failing all over the state. So you know where he ended up? He's Arnie Duncan's number 2, off the books, a special advisor to Arnie Duncan. He had to have a job, But that's what's happened in the last couple months. But Fair Test is a place you can get a lot of information on a local level about grassroots stuff. And it doesn't really get covered that much in the national press. This is not in the Politico, NPR firmament of the kind of stuff they want to cover very much. But it's certainly getting a lot of local attention because it's happening in the local communities. And, the Banner Herald isn't going to ignore it if it's happening here. I saw your hand, sir.
I was just gonna say, I'm probably older than anybody. And I went to separate but equal school.
Yes.
And our teachers made sure that we got educated so that whenever we left Athens, we would be able to get employed because we would have been well educated. I served in the military. I lived in California. I lived in Boston. I have never failed a test in my life because the teachers that we had thought it not robbery to prepare us for whatever came up. And they made sure we got it. We didn't have computers. We didn't have any of that.
Right.
All we had was a pencil and paper.
Yep.
And they really didn't want you to use the eraser. Right first. And I just wonder why in the world did we leave something that worked? If it worked then, it will work now.
Yeah.
I have a radio show and I talked about today. I never heard you before. I believe it's a plan to keep some people down. We don't want everybody to come up. And I asked the question on my radio show, supposing every citizen in Athens made $1,000 a week. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Everybody had $1,000 disposable income, and it went to whoever is selling something.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what would happen? But as y'all were saying, if you have designed a system to keep some people down, only 1% with all the money, 99% broke.
Yeah.
We talk about, but we don't do about.
Yeah.
We need to lift everybody up and give everybody a chance
Yeah.
to do what needs to be done. I don't know whether you saw it was in the Banner Herald 2 weeks ago that said in 13 years, America would fall because of what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and you know, what we're looking at is an economic situation and an environmental situation where the decisions are being made for the convenience and the profit of corporations.
Right.
Those corporations have rigged the political system, and now that we have Citizens United, we have the Koch brothers preparing to spend $900 million, $900 million on the next election cycle, perpetuating the myth that less taxes yields more services for more opportunity for poor people, and meanwhile we are abandoning the idea that it matters to address poverty. We have so much work that could be done. You know, you look around, there is a lot of work, productive work that would be contributing to society if we wanted to pay for it. Well, we do want to pay for it, those of us in the room, but if all the available money weren't being sucked up into that 1%, then there would be money available. Like I said, there is no shortage of money in our society. There is a shortage of money available to do constructive things with. There is a shortage of money available because of human decisions. This is all, our economic system is a human construct. And we have this idea that money moves based on, it's almost like Newton's laws of gravity, except it always flows upwards. You know, it works backwards. And, you know, and you can't challenge that, because if you do, you know that I would not be elected in Clarke County, I'm afraid. So,
Actually, Clarke, you might be okay. Georgia, definitely.
Well,
Definitely not Georgia.
I don't
We
know.
still have freedom of speech, whether they like
That,
it or not.
exactly right. We have freedom of speech, and
I say what I want.
that's right. That's exactly right. We have freedom of speech, we have freedom of association,
Right.
and we have freedom to organize. And if we don't take advantage of those freedoms, then we're not going to get anywhere.
I do think that our politicians are starting to listen. And I communicate a lot with politicians. They communicate a little bit with me. And lately, they're answering because they're hearing some of the same stuff he's talking about that affects us right here in this school from Oconee County people, who they really pay attention
Are
to.
you talking about in the
And-
county or in the state or in?
I'm talking about our local reps. One of them's here tonight, and Spencer's always paid attention to us. Spencer, he actually walks in schools every day and knows what's going on. But a lot of the local politicians, I mean local state level politicians, who pass these laws, who appoint commissions, who decide how schools are going to be funded, who decide what skids are going to be greased for the next boondoggle, they're starting to listen. And it doesn't hurt. I mean, if they get 2 or 3 letters, they get 10 letters. So, we all can do a little something. And if it, their emails are easy to find, and y'all are all good writers, and come from your own perspective. And it's not a
creative.
waste of time. It is not a waste of time to do that.
Be creative. Think of ways to get attention. We have to. We don't control the media. We have to create. We have to be creative to get our message across. So think about ways to communicate, ways to inspire, ways to use art, ways to use theater, ways to use music. Connect with the hearts and minds of people, and start organizing. Yeah.
Just, I would maybe caution against we've gone from education to economics. And I can't teach science, but I know a little bit about economics. And one of my worries is when we start pitting, the haves and have-nots, then it gets, we open up a whole new basket. And you mentioned the 15 Peter on that, not going into all the economics, is the middle class is the vast majority of those who need that money back to spend, not the 1%.
How has the middle class done since 2008?
Well, because a person making $75,000, $150,000, any bank account is, when you make 1% on the money that you make, you get it back, you're gonna get taxed.
How much is
Yeah,
that?
okay.
That's like $300. When I get interest on my checking, on my savings account,
Okay, I'm not gonna do that.
it's like so pitiful, the amount that you know,
If you
I don't
take the
know.
numbers that you can, it's founded. If you take the numbers, how many people are middle class and how much money that is out there. So all I'm saying is, when you start talking about where this money comes from and you start saying, let's tax capital gains, which again, in a savings account, if you put money in a savings account and it makes 5% and you take some of that gains back out.
If you could show me a bank that's paying 5%, I'd like to know it. I have not seen a bank.
For our next
paying
class, we're going to
5%.
redesign the economic system. I think what Alex is saying, Alex is.
You know what?
Alex is.
They're
Realize
sure.
that, oh, you're talking about me, because I actually did take out some money from that. That aside, I was just throwing
Yeah.
that out as caution. I'm not.
Well, you know,
I'm not a 1% person, so I don't have a lot of what you do now.
so far, if you look at what has happened to the middle class, especially since 2008, the middle class has gotten nothing of the economic gains from the so-called recovery. 95% of the economic gains since that recovery have gone to the 1%. So the policy, and we have policies that are privileging those with money. They have the money to lobby, to control Congress, to control President Obama in terms of his education policies. I know somebody who worked on his presidential campaign, and she told me that, and she was had a much more progressive outlook on all of these issues, and she told me that she knew the day that the money dropped on the campaign, several $100 million came in from the hedge fund managers and the banking industry into the campaign, and all of a sudden, those people were calling the shots in terms of education reform, and that's why we got Arne Duncan as our Secretary of Education, because he is their man. Yeah.
I got two questions. One's real simple. Like you were at Clarke Middle, I was curious what you had to say about the one-to-one technology there. And the second one's more complex. Like you talked a lot about technology,
Yeah.
testing,
Sure.
economics, politics.
Right.
Just curious in terms of ed reform, you know, where, if you think, is what you have to say about charter schools, Teach for America, and those kinds of programs, and where, if anywhere, you think they might have a place
All right.
in trying to get to a better.
Okay.
Let me break in one quick second. That's two questions. It's going to take them a minute. And I saw Karen's hand up. If anybody else has a question, get him ready, because we did say we're going to be out of here at 8 and we want to respect people's time. So
All right.
crunch it.
Yeah. All right, I'll try. So technology, you know, I think, you know, as a teacher, I was buying looking for technology constantly. I was the first guy with a Laserdisc player in my school, you know, and those were supposed to transform, revolutionize things too. You know, and I bought computers with my own money for my students. I had a girls' technology class that met 7:30 in the morning. The girls would come before school to learn technology. So I'm not against technology. I like technology when students can use it to create, when they can use it to explore the world. I don't like the idea that you are going to funnel learning through that device, and the idea that there's going to be this big cloud that becomes that becomes knowledgeable about the student. I think a teacher's brain and capacity to engage with the student is far more powerful. So that's my, you know, one-to-one. It's not. It's the problem with technology is that it is incentivized by profit, and so you have these deals being driven by tremendous profit, and you have school officials that go from positions like Joel Klein went from being the chancellor of New York schools to working for Rupert Murdoch's Amplify. So you have a revolving door. It's like those of you that are old enough remember Eisenhower warning about the military-industrial complex. You have something very similar happening with the testing, curriculum, education industry.
K-12, Milken.
Where it reinforces, where the profit motive reinforces and incentivizes things that are not high quality for students. Then you threw in both TFA and charter schools, which are two different things. I worked closely with Teach for America teachers in Oakland who were brought in. We had about 15 years ago, we got a new superintendent and he raised teachers' pay significantly. As I mentioned, we had a teacher turnover problem. Funny thing, when we were no longer the lowest paid district in Alameda County, we no longer had this huge turnover problem. But then the state said, well, you're spending too much money on teachers, and so you're fiscally insolvent, and they made us give back the raise that we had gotten, and the teacher turnover came back. And so then they brought in Teach for America to replace the teachers that were turning over. And guess what? Teach for America teachers commit for 2 years, and then they leave. 50% of them leave after 2 years. Another 50% leave after the next year. So you have institutionalized high turnover. This is highly disruptive to schools. It is shown, research has shown that teacher turnover contributes to low student achievement, especially in African American and Latino schools. So Teach for America is a hoax as a solution, as a systemic solution. And then they say they're not about actually teaching, they're about developing leaders. But then the philosophy within Teach for America is we are going to prove we're effective by raising test scores. And they are, if you want to talk about an organization built around test score data, that is them. Their entire support program is built around requiring their interns to focus on test scores and raise them. And that's the leadership that they bring to school districts, people like Michelle Reed, who are all about test scores. So I do not think Teach for America is a useful innovation. I think it's a disruptive innovation, and I think schools that become dependent on Teach for America do a great disservice to the students that they're purporting to serve.
Karen, before you get to charter schools.
Yes.
We have 1 minute. Karen wants to ask a question.
Okay.
And the charter school discussion will be in our next voluntary seminar with Ed. Anybody who wants to stay around, I think we should stop at 8 so people can leave if
Okay.
they want. But the whole room may stay, and you can talk about
All
charters
right.
for half an hour.
Sure.
Meanwhile, Karen, ask your question, and then I'm going to say goodnight. And we're going to let Anthony at least try to get away.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you for stimulating our thinking. And then I just want to say that, meanwhile, tomorrow morning, a lot of school children will show up to schools in this county, met by very well-intentioned, hardworking teachers.
Absolutely.
And many of us in this room have tried to support teachers to speak up about these very issues that you've mentioned. And our experience has been that they are frightened to do so. So I guess my question would be, how do you suggest that we help them?
Well, I think if you think about the teachers from their point of view, they have a relationship with their students. They have a relationship with their students' parents, and they have a relationship with their administrators. They don't necessarily have a relationship with the community, especially around these issues. So I think the best way to support them would to foster that community-wide discussion about these issues. And if I know some of your administrators are supportive of this challenge to the state, to the federal policy direction that they're being required to implement. So I think the teachers need to see that hopefully they will not be persecuted as a result of participating in a public stand. I think the students can play a tremendous role. If the students and the parent community you know, it's very difficult to exact reprisals on students and parents who are acting together. And so if the students and parents can take that lead, then you can create space for your teachers to speak from their conscience. And I think you'll hear some really remarkable things if you're able to create that space.
Anthony, looking around this room, there's about half, there's 21 schools in this district, and about half of them are represented in this room. So it's not, you got a lot of Clarke Central people here, but we got a lot of people from maybe every school in the county, but a lot of the schools are represented here. But I want to thank you for being here. I want to make sure I'm not remiss. He is a capitalist. You got to give money. You got to give money to get this. It's the way it works. $19 right over there, and they're taking credit cards. That was brought up by someone in so.
Yes.
Buy a book if you want. Go to his blog, and if you want to just do the short circuiting of this book, you can Google Anthony Cody, Dialogue, Gates Foundation, Living in Dialogue, because you'll find his series that he wrote about that became the basis for the book. It's a cheaper way to read more about. But in the meantime, I do advocate buying the book. I'm trying to get him to buy your book. I'm soft selling. I'm soft selling. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.